So welcome, everybody. I'm Sister Teresa Jackson. I'm the prioress, the leader of the Center for Benedictine Living at the Monastery of St. Gertrude here in Cottonwood, Idaho. And it's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you to our series. This is the first of Monastic Land Stewardship, Caring for the Earth in Troubled Times. So part of the reason we're doing this is that caring for our earth has been a critical focus here at the Monastery of St. Gertrude. Well, pretty much since we came here in 1907. We are stewards of about 1,400 acres of land here in north central Idaho. And we really see our Benedictine monastic commitment as central to care of the earth. This series of presentations is only one part of our ministry of trying to connect people who have a faith-based concern for our earth and our land. And so we hope we can raise awareness, foster connections among monastics and others who care deeply for our earth. So just a reminder, when you registered for the whole series. So make sure that your calendar is marked every Saturday at 10 a.m. from now until August, and show up for some amazing presentations. And today, to get us started off, we are very privileged to have Dr. Jason Brown of Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. So we're international is what that means today. And he will be discussing the intersection of monastic values, such as stability and the practice of Lectio Divina, and how these can be practiced in deep relationship with our earth. He'll also be introducing his forthcoming book, Dwelling in the Wilderness, Modern Monks in the American West. And so after his presentation, we'll have a chance for questions and dialogue. So take it away, Jason.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Sister Teresa. I just want to note also that I wish it was every Saturday between now and September, but it's once a month. We're doing it once a month between now. We have some great speakers. Samuel Torvund is here in the crowd with us. He'll be next month. That'll be great. Talk about his book, Monastic Ecological Wisdom. We have a really cool project that came out of an organization called Nuns and Nuns, you may have heard of, but they're now called Land Justice Futures, which is a little more digestible. And then Douglas Christie will be with us, and then we'll kind of return where we started. So Sister Carol Ann at the Abbey there, St. Gertrude, is going to talk about their monastic forest management plan. So we really have a lot of really cool speakers planned. And I mean, the whole conversation really started between Sister Teresa and I, just sort of over coffee at the Abbey, about, what a monastic land ethic might look like, And so this first talk is going to start with the vow of stability, or what I call a bond of stability for those of us who are not vowed. And just basically the idea that rooting more deeply in place is a contemplative practice, but it's also a political strategy for our troubled times. So as I pull up my PowerPoint, I'd love to hear where folks are from. Where are you from, right? That's a very simple question, and sometimes it can invoke a sense of anxiety if you've moved around a lot. But what's the first thing that comes to mind when I ask that question? Where are you from? Is it a planetary identity? Is it a region? Is it an indigenous territory? What comes to mind when I say that? And just type that in the chat if you don't mind. Where are you from? So I pull up my screen or my PowerPoint here. Where are you from? What does that bring up for folks? Can everyone access the chat in Zoom? Yeah, just type into the chat what comes up for you. Where are you from? There we go. The first one, we've got North Dakota, Texas, California, and the Nez Perce ancestral territory. We've got a meadow and a forest on the San Juan Islands. We've got Nashville, Tennessee, the Puget Sound, the land of the Puyallup peoples, Salish Sea, Lakewood, Washington, and Bourne on an island in the Columbia River, the Maine woods, and now in Idaho's Camas Prairie, Church of the Woods, New Hampshire, the Merrimack River watershed. So we really are a pretty diverse group, North American at least. So yeah, I'm coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia, not Washington. And as a kind of traditional, or at least has become a tradition, protocol in Canada, we like to say that we're on unceded territory. And that's maybe not something that folks say in land acknowledgements in the States, but certainly I've heard it. But the idea is that no treaties were signed in this part of the world. And so we're living in a very interesting time of both reconciliation and decolonization in British Columbia. A lot of really interesting conversations happening along those lines. And so I hold that tension in my own sense of place, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I wasn't born here. I was actually raised in a town called Yorba Linda. So it's a Spanish colonial name for now a part of Southern California, which was part of the Tongva territory. And my sense of place in Southern California is also pretty fraught with the intense consumerism of that place. But what I remember most about growing up, what I miss, if I think about it, are the orange blossoms, the orange trees, the eucalyptus trees, right? And those are trees that are just as transplanted to that place as my ancestors were. And so that's kind of those are the song lines that I'm walking these days, are questions of place and the tension between my own sort of colonial history and the resurgence of indigenous lifeways in this part of the world. But my book, I didn't do ethnography with indigenous peoples for a number of reasons. But what I ended up doing was some ethnography, or like guided semi-structured interviews with Roman Catholic monks. And so a lot of the lessons that I'm drawing about how to root in place as an ecological strategy, or as an activist strategy, are coming from my experience at 4 monasteries in the American West. So today I just want to talk briefly about this idea of sense of place, give it a little bit of background in the Christian and contemplative tradition, and then just give you a few examples from my book of how I learned about monastic sense of place. So what is sense of place? Sense of place is a deeply qualitative connection to where we are, right? We have 5 senses, but we also have this sort of spatial orientation in our evolution. And one of the ways to talk about that is biophilia or topophilia, right? That we have this real deep sense that we are organisms, biological beings, and that we are oriented in places, topos. And so Wilson talked about the idea of biophilia, that we have this deep connection to our biological lineages, and that we should move away from our kind of industrial anthropocentric ethic to a more bio or ecocentric view of life, which includes our places. But then Yifu Tuan, who's a geographer, coined this term topophilia, where it's not just that we have this vague connection to life, but to our particular locations. And for a while in the social science literature, there was a lot of talk about this topophilia as a kind of symbolic landscape. So our culture making brains made meaning with places through images and symbols, right? This idea that the land is a kind of cultural construction, so symbolic landscapes. And it's certainly true that if you are immersed in a tradition like the Bible, the symbols, the stories, the ideas, the motifs are going to influence how you interact with a place. But something that I learned in my doctoral work with the Catholic monks is that sense of place is much more embodied, and the place participates a heck of a lot more in the meaning making than this idea of land as a symbolic uh, resource that we kind of impose meaning on. So this is Tim Ingold. He's an anthropologist from the UK, and he uses this word dwelling, right? That's the word I use for the title of my book, to dwelling in the wilderness. So dwelling for Tim Ingold means that human beings do not, in their movements, inscribe their life histories upon the surface of nature as do writers upon the page, but rather these histories are woven along with the life cycles of plants and animals into the texture of the surface itself. So it's not just this cultural construction that sits on the surface, but something that's much more deeply entangled with the world itself. And Christian Norberg Schultz called it, or talked about it this way. He said to dwell means to belong to a given place. And that's pretty darn close to an indigenous understanding of place, is that you don't just impose meaning on a place, but the place speaks back. The places speak back to us. And so meaning is negotiated, cooperated, and co-constructed. And there's, thousands of examples of the really intricate fabrics that indigenous peoples have woven out of their places. But I'm going to move pretty quickly into the Christian contemplative tradition, just because of time. So Simon Weil talked about the idea of needing roots, right? This is part of our biophilic topophilia, you could say, right? That to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul, right? So even those more nomadic peoples, right? Certainly the biblical people started out as nomads. Even in kind of peripatetic cultures, we have a deep sense of rootedness in either the region or the cosmos. And so rootedness is a really important, almost deeply religious and spiritual need. So in the Bible, we basically have a kind of farmer's almanac of place names as one way to talk about the Bible. There's, of course, many other things. But as the Hebrew Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann said, in the Bible, there is no timeless space, right? There's no abstract space. There is also no spaceless time. There is rather storied place. That is, a place that has meaning because of the history that is lodged or attached there, right? So that's what I mean when I say that the Bible is a farmer's almanac of place names, right? That all of the encounters with the divine are rooted in place, and the motifs of exile from the garden, return to the garden through obedience to the Torah, are all deeply woven into the experience of place. Even if it's exile, even if it's escaping from slavery in Egypt, even if it's conquest, right? All of these histories are embroidered into the land itself. And it's a very physical, material kind of process, right? Stone altars are the origins of temples and sacred groves and mountain peaks, high places that are at the origin of Hebrew monotheism. And then, of course, the object of the radical monotheistic counter reformation, or I guess reformation of the Hebrew monotheism, where they talk about pulling down the altars of Asherah, for example. And Jacob, this is a great example, right, of a place name. But Jacob, when he becomes Israel, is initiated by the angelic being. The place name, he gives the place a name because of the event, the holy theophany that happens there, right? As he's waiting to cross the Jabbok River, he names the place Penuel because he saw the face of the divine, or a manifestation of the divine there. And so throughout the whole Bible, the Hebrew canon, we have this deep sense of place names, prophetic tombs, and we have events. The New Testament is a recapitulation of these places. The Mount of Olives, the garden, and the tomb as the garden, and the exile in the desert, and the transfiguration, and the connection with Moses. Each of the major events in the life of Jesus is a kind of recapitulation of these sacred places in the Hebrew canon. Now, what's interesting is that within the Christian tradition, so as we're moving 200 or 300 years from the life of Jesus of Nazareth, we start to see a tension between the more transcendent sense of placelessness, of, heaven now becomes a place beyond the earth rather than the fulfillment of the earth's destiny as it was imagined in the Hebrew imagination. But, so places take on important significance, but ultimately the mystic's eyes are fixed on heaven. You can see here this portrait of Saint Anthony, the great Egyptian monastic hermit. He's there with his text in the foreground, the natural world in the background, and his eyes fixed on the heavens. So Belden Lane, who's an absolutely brilliant scholar of place and sacred place and Christian contemplative spirituality, he talks about it as a tension, right, between place and placelessness. One finds a continuing tension, he says, between place and placelessness, between the local and the universal. God is here in this place at Bethlehem, Lourdes, Iona, and even Boston and Salt Lake. But God is also not here, or not fully encapsulated by the place. And so in the pagan sense, right, places were marked a kind of divine presence that was associated with a kind of anthropomorphic being, whether it was a nature spirit or a god or a goddess. But in the contemplative Christian sense, the place becomes a more sacramental signifier of God's universal presence. And that's something we can even see in the life of Saint Anthony, right? So Saint Athanasius wrote a very popular biography of Anthony, and he's talking about his very first journey with the Bedouins out into the desert, right? He moved farther and farther from his village when he decided to become a strict ascetic. And even though he was a pretty strict ascetic and a spiritual warrior, right? He saw himself literally going to battle with demons. He also became quite fond of his desert hermitage. And so Athanasius frames it this way. He says, "And having journeyed with them, the Bedouins, 3 days and 3 nights, he came to a very lofty mountain, and at the foot of the mountain ran a clear spring, whose waters were sweet and very cold. Outside there was a plain, and a few uncared for palm trees. Anthony then, as it were, moved by God, loved the place, for it was the spot which he who had spoken with him by the banks of the river had pointed out. So having first received loaves from his fellow travelers, he abode in the mountain alone, no one else being with him, and recognized it as his own home. And he remained in that place for the future." So even that really, really strong sense of yearning for the for the transcendent, we find St. Anthony rooted in place. And this is the origin of the vow of stability, right? Much later, the Franciscans will issue this vow for a kind of mendicant wandering. But the origins of Benedictine and Cistercian monasticism are in this sense of rootedness to the place, stability. And this is what I learned in my during my dissertation. I visited 4 different monasteries in the American West: New Camaldoli Hermitage in California, New Clairvaux Abbey in the Central Valley of California, Our Lady of Guadalupe Abbey in Carlton, Oregon, and Christ in the Desert outside of Abiquiu, New Mexico. And so I'm just going to show you a couple of images that I took, or pictures that I snapped while I was there, and give you a real basic summary of what I mean by a monastic sense of place. So here's New Camaldoli Hermitage. You can see that they really are dwelling in the wilderness. They're a wilderness monastery, even though there are, of course, some pretty wealthy properties right around here along the Pacific Coast Highway. They are in the Ventana Wilderness. They're also pretty close to the Tassajara Zen Monastery, which, and all of them have been evacuated by fire in the last decade, maybe more than once. And in the last 5 years, the monastery has been cut off from both north and south PCH approaches because of landslides. They've been getting a lot of landslides. And so sometimes it's closed from the north, sometimes from the south, sometimes from both. So they've been having a really hard time, having a stable access to their abbey. And this to me, the monks admitted this, but this to me shows just how deeply committed they are to that place, because it's been very expensive and very difficult to recuperate their own property and driveway, and then all of the access troubles they've had from the landslides. But you can see here, once you get up to the monastery, it's a gorgeous view of the Pacific Ocean. They live in this sort of southern extent of the range of the redwood, the coastal redwood trees, some of which you can see have suffered pretty severe scarring from the history of fires. It's a fire-adapted landscape. But in this tree in particular, they created a little shrine to the Virgin Mary. And then on the right here, you can see their chapel and bell tower, which has been done in a kind of California rancho style with a cloister garden in the foreground that is not cloistered, in this sort of cinder block style. So one of the things that I noticed right away is that the places that the monks live in are much more richly storied than me arriving there for the first time. I was just sort of getting to know the lay of the land, but many of these monks had lived there for a decade or more. And so these places really held a lot of stories for them, right? So many of the lineages of these monks really looked very consciously to their origins with St. Anthony and the Desert Fathers. They saw themselves carrying out that mission of living in the desert. So there's already this sense that, what might look like a coastal wilderness is also this sort of sacred landscape that the monks have consecrated for prayer. In addition, they spend a lot of time in the monastic liturgy, the liturgy of the hours. And so their daily and seasonal liturgies can really tune you into the cycles and the seasons. So not just dawn and dusk, dawn, midday, dusk, night, but also winter, spring, summer, fall. So there's a real sense that the liturgy, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, where Christmas is in the dark of the winter solstice, and Easter is in the growing light of the spring equinox. There's this real sense that the Paschal mystery is embedded in the liturgy of the place. And so that is a powerful kind of adherent to the land. The liturgy becomes embedded in the phenology of the place, the flowering and the leafing out of the plants, and they're dying back in the fall and the winter, the rains and the dry season. The other thing that happens is that their own memories attach to the place. So they spend a lot of time on foot between buildings, between the cell and the chapel and the refectory and the library. But they also spend a lot of time on the land in long hikes and walks. And so their own epiphanies, their own symbolic landscapes come with them onto the land. And so, the monks at New Camaldoli invested a lot of mystical meaning in the mist, right? So this cloudy mist at New Camaldoli and the mountains. There was this real sense of the mystic journey to the summit of the mountain. And even small flowers, right? Thérèse of Lisieux and the small flowers, the weather, the sunsets, right? All of these are invested with the symbols of the land. But it isn't just symbolic, right? The land does a lot of the holding and the populating of these symbols. And this is one example of what I mean by that. So the Psalms, there's a verse in the Psalms that talks about the mountains melting like wax, right? This is one of the kind of warrior psalms. But when I asked one of the monks at New Camaldoli if he had any kind of connections, had made any connections between the Psalms and the land, he said this, right? He basically said, and he was very excited about this. He said, "The mountains that melt like wax" is a phrase from one of the Psalms. I have been here through a number of El Nino events and bad storms, and the mountains melt like wax, literally. I remember another time it was raining so hard, and just as we had said something about the rain and the showers, this torrent opened up. We were in the chapel. It was on a Sunday morning. Everybody just looked at everybody, just what we were singing, and it was happening, right? And so it isn't just that the symbol from the Psalms is taken out onto the land, but the land itself speaks back to the symbol. And so there's this really strong sense of dwelling, right? That there's this co-creation of meaning between the land, the place, and the person. New Clairvaux Abbey in the Central Valley, a very different landscape. So they're near the Sacramento River. And so there's a little bit of like scruffy, wild areas, but for the most part, it's kind of a quilt of walnut and prune orchards in a very beautiful agrarian landscape. They also have some vineyards as well. They've started a winery there. And so it's a lovely place, but a very different kind of landscape. And so rather than relating to the place of the wilderness, like, New Camaldoli and the Desert Fathers, they really connect with their Cistercian ancestors who are very much agrarian, at least in the context of the feudal system of the Middle Ages. Right. So they really see their place as a kind of monastic, agrarian, sacred landscape. You can see here the gate to get into the campus, which is not a traditional cloister garden. It's also arranged in a kind of California rancho style, because Leland Stanford actually owned this property before the monks. And so it was laid out as a working winery and vineyard before the monks, or before it was taken over by a dairy operation, and then the monks purchased it. They continued the dairy operation for a little while, but then pretty much converted everything to walnuts and prunes. They get around mostly on these California beach cruiser bikes because the campus is so big. But they, up until very recently, the monks managed all of the agrarian operations, so all the orchards and vineyards. But because the community is getting older, they have contracted with some management companies that co-manage the orchard and the vineyard with them. So they participate, but they're not completely in charge because of the lack of person power. Another pretty cool feature of this monastery is that they brought, they purchased, it was already in California, but they purchased this chapter house. It was a 12th century Spanish Cistercian chapter house made of beautiful limestone. And they purchased it and brought it to the abbey and worked with consultants to reconstruct this chapter house so that for their own chapel. They basically rebuilt their chapel. And so there's a real strong sense of place even within the building, because the stones have this very sacred and historic quality to them, in addition to the sort of objective beauty of the archways that have that vaulted ceiling. And so it's a lovely place, right? For prayer. And so there's a deep sense of place, even within the monastic structures that I found pretty common among the monasteries. Another feature of this sense of place is that sacredness does not always stay put. It's not like, the pagan shrine where you come to a sacred place consistently to make offerings and to be devoted. Rather, sacred place tends to break through, right, in unexpected moments. And one of the monks called this a charged moment, right? So a lot of the experiences that monks have on the land would be walking and then some kind of epiphany or some kind of realization, or a moment like this in the photograph. I was sitting in the cemetery with a monk, and I was asking him some questions, and I turned around, and the pollen from these columnar cypress trees was catching the rising sun just so. And I just happened to snap a shot of it at the right moment. And it really was a kind of charged, sacred moment, which only lasted a few moments. But it was a really beautiful illustration of what one monk called the charged moments, where I could come back to this place 100 different times and it would never quite be the same. And that's kind of the effective quality of a sense of a monastic sense of place. The memories of these charged moments then attach themselves to the place, even if you don't have the same experience again. Another example of this, so I was out in the orchards with one of the monks, and he talked about an epiphany he had very early in his monastery career. He said, "There was a kind of critical moment in my vocation in this orchard, a moment of great purification, and I guess you'd say a moment of great trial, but a moment of great grace. It was a very trying moment, kind of a dark night, and then epiphany, as it were. In fact, it took place right in this first row here, right? And so the rows looked pretty similar to me, but as we were moving through the orchard, he pointed it out and became very reverent about this place. So that it was a charged moment during his work in the orchard that the place now holds for him. Our Lady of Guadalupe Abbey, definitely, I mean, don't tell the other monks, but definitely my favorite place. But that's probably because I've spent the most time there. I've done a lot of retreats here, and the monks are very dear to me. But you can see here that this is also an agrarian context, but the abbey property is something like 1,200 acres of forest that the monks themselves have replanted since the 1950s. And you can kind of see it here, but maybe if I zoom in a little bit, you can see here, right by the Our Lady of Guadalupe flag, is a restored Gary oak savanna. So not only are they doing silviculture and forestry, but they're doing ecological restoration with this Gary oak savanna, Quercus garryana. It's a very cool place. Here's another shot through the Gary Oak Savannah of the chapel in winter. I always tend to be there in the winter, so I very seldom see the trees in full leaf, but I'll have to get back this summer. So Guadalupe Abbey is also a Cistercian or Trappist abbey, like New Clairvaux. And their chapel is built, a lot of this timber comes from their own forest, but you can see how their Liturgy of the Hours is punctuated by the very open glass ceiling and windows. And so it feels like you're almost outside when you're in the liturgy. So very dark in the early morning, very bright at midday, and then they face west, and so you can see the sunset. Very beautiful. But from here, we can see that in addition to the sacredness of place and the storied nature of place, that what really makes all of this possible is the vow of stability, right? And Abbot Stephen Harding, he was an early Cistercian in the 11th century. He admonished his monks to become lovers of the place and of the rule. And I think that's a very powerful Benedictine value or ethic, right? So whereas the mendicants see themselves as being a bit more peripatetic, the Benedictine monks are rooted in place. Their vow of stability is their path to the divine. Right? They seek God in the place, through the place, and even through the annoying habits of their fellow monks or sisters, right? That is part of the vow of stability. And this was very obvious to me when the monks would talk about their formation. They wouldn't just talk about the classes they took, they would talk about how the land held them through their formation and making their simple and final vows. There's a really strong sense that the place is part of that vow of stability, not just a subject of it. So in addition, as I mentioned, the liturgical cycle or the habitus, right? The habit of going through this day to day. It tunes you into the cycles, and that is all connected back to formation, back to stability. And then manual work, charged moments. Those are the kinds of things that populate the land with a sense of place, a sense of memory, or the land itself becomes a kind of moral landscape or a sacred landscape. And of course, this is what the ethnographers find in indigenous communities who have inhabited their places for thousands of years. And especially if they're not literate, right? Stories and myths attach themselves to places. But what I found was that even folks who had been connected to a place for a decade or more started to develop these habits of putting down roots into the place, and that the place co-created that meaning. One of my dearest friends at the monastery of Guadalupe his name is Brother Patrick in the book. He has since died, and he died doing what he loved. He was mowing the lawn when he had a heart attack. But he was a very simple Cistercian monk, not very, he would say that he was not a very sophisticated theologian, but he loved working outside, and I got to work with him quite a bit. And he said, just sort of musing about place. He says, well, it's being close to the earth, for one thing, and nature itself, just working around the trees and the brush and animals. I think it's a wonderful thing because I actually think God almost made us that way. Working in nature brings you closer to God. So that real sense that the divine is present in the land, and that your connection to the place, to the animals, is part of that divine connection. Now, I want to return to a quote from one of the monks at Clairvaux Abbey, because this one really relates to the vow of stability. This is how he talked about stability. He compares himself to a tree, like this sycamore tree you can see on the slide that's in that kind of scruffy wilderness along the Sacramento River. There was actually an abandoned hermitage right behind this tree, so the monks used it as a kind of wilderness place. He says, "You become part of the land. Our vow of stability grounds us." And an image that was really helpful for me was the idea of these trees taking root. That was the image of stability that I had. The longer I stay here, the more I can see myself growing in ways I never thought possible. It's, of course, not easy, or not always easy, staying in one place, but the longer you stay, the higher you can reach, just like a tree. Lastly, Christ in the Desert Abbey, another wilderness abbey. You can see that it's way out here in the wilderness, literally a designated U.S. federal land wilderness, and wild and scenic river, the Chama River. It's a 13-mile dirt road to get to Christ in the Desert. And if it's raining, there is a chance that you may not get there that day because the mud is very clayey and so very slippery. It's a beautiful place, and the abbey, you can see, it feels like it just is sort of, it emerges from these beautiful cliffs. It's sort of, they're not quite red rock, but they're definitely the sort of striated sandstone, beautiful canyons of the Southwest. And so they connect deeply with the desert fathers, but also with they're kind of more of a traditionalist monastery. So they see themselves observing the rule of Benedict very strictly, and they're very proud of their observance, right? And so it's not just the place and the way that they've integrated themselves into New Mexican aesthetics and culture, but their identities as Benedictines. And of course, I found all of the same ideas here, charged moments and storied places and deep connections between the Psalms and the land. But I also found a real strong sense of the apophatic, right? The beyond words sense of place. And so you can see this image of the Chama River. You know, sometimes when you find yourself in a place like this, words aren't enough, right? Words fail. And so one of the monks, towards the end of the interview, I think maybe he just wanted me to shut up or stop asking questions, but he says, there has to be a point where we're just in silence before God, and also in silence before the beauty that he's created without trying to put things on it. See? Letting go of all that imagery and being here in the presence, right? And so right back to that tension between place and placelessness, because particular places are gateways to the placelessness of the divine. The immanent and the transcendent are not opposed, but linked in a kind of a mysterious way. So the apophatic sense of place is often found on the other side of this. And this is, of course, pretty integral to things like Lectio Divina, right? We sit with the words of the scripture, and then we just sit in the beyondness of words, or the space between the words, right? There's an apophatic dimension to Lectio Divina. And so for me, that has become a practice of what I call Lectio Terra, right? So a Lectio Terra treats the land as a kind of sacred text. So you sit with the land, you sit with the images, the species, the particulars of the place. You notice what's coming up for you in the place. You even praise God through the place, prayer, oratio, and then you sink into a kind of apophatic contemplation, a contemplation that's beyond the particulars of the land or the place, and is a kind of transcendent or just quiet kind of prayer, right? So apophatic spirituality, Lectio Divina, and I would call it, Lectio Terra. Now, all of this was really powerful for me as a doctoral student. I wrote a dissertation and then a short book about it. But as someone who's very concerned about the environmental crisis and climate change, one of the things I have found is that the monastic sense of place has really informed my own sense of place. And so I haven't taken a vow of stability anywhere, but I have tried to cultivate a bond of stability with Vancouver, with Cascadia, with the rainforest of the Pacific West, with the traditional territories of the Musqueam and the Tsleil-Waututh and the Squamish peoples. And so that's how I would talk about it as we move away from the monastery. And I want to talk to conclude about, kind of what we might do with this in our own lives. So first, I would say I would take the risk of generalizing to say that modernity has flourished in a kind of placelessness, right? That many of us who are European descended in North America, generally speaking, have inherited a devalued sense of place, right? Mobility is much more important, right? Romantic nature, right? Not living off the land, but going to nature, escaping from our apartments to go to the natural world, right? We've romanticized some places, we've commodified lots of places, but we've really put a stronger value on mobility. You go where the jobs are, not where your family is from, necessarily. And again, generally speaking. We're also living in a time of uprootedness, of displacement, right? So climate change promises or threatens, I guess you'd say, to displace many people. And uprootedness is in some ways existential as well as geographic. And so the word Anthropocene, this previously geological and now more metaphorical epoch of human domination, is certainly a kind of strange abstraction, right? We're talking about carbon that we can't see in the atmosphere. But this thing called climate change, this hyperobject, you could say, climate change, promises to impact particular places very differently and particular communities, marginalized communities, very differently. So for me, a sense of place is a powerful lens to look at the climate crisis and even, the existential or spiritual crisis of modernity and post-modernity. So one of the ways I've talked about it is through the lens of fullness, right? So mindfulness is a secularized Buddhist meditation technique that tunes in to the body and to the emotions. Very popular, I'm sure you've heard of it. Another approach I've read about is Marcia Bjornenrud, who is a geologist who talks about the importance of timefulness, the idea that we are embedded in deep geologic time and not just the day-to-day kind of busy cycle of modernity. And so this is where I kind of came up with the notion that we need a deeper sense of placefulness, right? So Lectio Terra is a practice of placefulness where we cultivate attending to what is and what arises in our places, even when it's difficult, even when it's strange or uncertain, even when it's heartbreaking. So it's not a romanticism of place or a pristine wilderness ethic, but as I've wrote in my book, it's a dwelling in the wilderness, right? We want to dwell in the wild places responsibly. And those wild places aren't necessarily designated wildernesses, but the kinds of wildness that we find in ourselves and even in, our suburban neighborhoods. So cultivating a sense of place is, I think, learning a kind of liturgy, right? Because the cosmos and the seasons and the days all have patterns. So I like to talk about this as a kind of liturgy of place that we participate in. So depending on where you are and what you're interested in, tuning in to one or all of these things might be more interesting to you. right? So I'm find myself very fascinated by the night sky, even though most of the time I can't see it up here because it's so cloudy. But cycles of stars and sun and moon, I wanna be more connected and involved in that. So that's ongoing. Even at least familiar with the astrological archetypes and the stories, the indigenous and classical stories attached to constellations. Understanding the weather and the patterns of seasons, tuning our bodies into the seasonality of our places and the subtle changes and qualities in, even atmospheric pressure or precipitation or the kinds of rain that we get, the kinds of snow. Geology. I know for some of us, rocks aren't that interesting, but I find the bones of the earth to be very interesting, and it's something that I'm always trying to understand more. And I feel like I have a very, very rudimentary understanding of geology, especially because it's so complicated here on the edge of the continent. But it's something I think that is part of at least the infrastructure of the temple of place, right? The it within which we carry out the liturgy of place. And here's one that may not resonate. Certainly the monks that I met, they weren't real keen on learning the names of plants, right? They loved to be in the natural world, but they didn't know a whole lot more about plant names than I did. And so, but I think this is important, especially if you're interested in Alexio Terra, where you want to tune into the particulars of place. So the Latin names or the common names, or even indigenous names of plants and animals and fungi, and then, you know, um, in addition, their uses, medicinal plants and the edible fungi and the phenology of when berries appear in the forest, for example. Another example would be the soundscape. We tend to be pretty focused on the visual. And so learning the songs and the seasonality of birds is a really powerful way to tune into the soundscape of a place and to be aware of how it's changing with climate change, which is going to be, I think, a bit heartbreaking because we may lose some of the voices in that chorus. And then keeping a record or a journal of your memories, your lessons, your experiences in places, the significant symbols, writing poetry about places, all of the ways that we can weave ourselves into place through experience and the spoken word and the unspoken word. So these are, of course, just a few possibilities for a practice of Lectio Terra or learning the liturgy of place. All right, I've got 3 more slides and then we'll open it up for some conversation. But one thing I want to caution against is the weaponization of place or even just an over-romanticization. Because, for example, if I go into the forest here in Vancouver, it's pretty easy to just be like, I'm in a forest and it's a beautiful natural place. But the forests here have a history of industrial logging and colonization. These are the, overgrown orchards of indigenous peoples and their food systems before the English colonized. So I would really strongly caution against a sense of place as just nature romanticism, because almost all of our places have a tense history of colonization and at least cultural background, if you want to call it that. The other thing is that sacred places can be weaponized by ethno-nationalism, right? We've seen that in the United States. We see that in colonization and the narratives that accompany it. But we're seeing it right now big time in Israel, Palestine, and in India, right? The Hindu nationalists basically demolished the Babri Masjid in 1992. The Supreme Court gave their stamp of approval, but that is an ongoing conflict over identity and place because the masjid was built supposedly on the site, a sacred site to Ram in the Hindu canon, though that is, of course, contested. Israel-Palestine, the decolonial narrative of Israel-Palestine is that Israel is a settler colonial state. But for many secular and religious Jews, right, Israel is the place of their ancestors. The bones of their ancestors are there. And so in their imagination, they have a claim to those places and apparently a claim to defend themselves against the incursions of the Palestinian militants. So that is a very heartbreaking and difficult live conflict, but I would say that it is certainly rooted in some ways to sense of place. Another one would be that in the history of humanity, knowing one's place has been rooted in oppression, right? Racism and segregation. What's your place is not a warm and fuzzy thing if you're embedded in a caste system or a racialized social system. And so we have to be aware of when sense of place begins to dehumanize or at least separate and other. And those are definitely, I think, several, not all, but several important cautions to an overly romanticized sense of place. And lastly, I would say, just in summary, I think that placefulness and lectio terra are really powerful, important practices for the coming times, right? We live in a beautiful world, and so celebrating and immersing ourselves in the beauty of the natural world is an important practice. But we're also going to need to witness some of the deeply troubling changes that are coming to our particular places, because it's very likely that we will not fight to save what we do not love. And sense of place is a way to fall in love with our places, even as climate change threatens to change them. So we need to witness that and not look away from that. So sense of place is not going to be easy. It's going to include resistance, and it's also going to include some grieving. And lastly, I'd say, for me at least, I want to trouble and reflect on the tension of my own body in this place. And I don't expect, honestly, to resolve that tension in my lifetime. For someone who's lived in Vancouver only a decade and who grew up in California and lived in Connecticut and Utah, my sense of place is always going to be a little different. And there's always going to be a tension between myself and my place and where I'm from and where I'm going. But this image here is from my very own neighborhood in Vancouver. I spend a lot of time just in my neighborhood with the trees here. And this plane tree is one of my friends. And so I think that sense of place doesn't have to happen out in the wilderness. It can happen in our right out our front doors. But I think it's a very powerful practice of rooting in place and then learning how to defend those places as climate and ecological crises inevitably get worse. And all of this, I would say, I would attribute to the time I spent with the monks, right? I didn't take a vow of stability, but I am trying to cultivate a bond of stability with my places. And so thank you very much. And this is the book that I wrote. And now I'd love to open it up to a wider conversation, questions, but also I'd love to just hear about your places and the places that you hold sacred, because it's 11 o'clock. We've got plenty of time for conversation, probably wrap it up around 11:30 at the latest, right? And because there's so few of us, I think we can have a pretty good conversation. So thank you very much. Anyone want to? Oh yeah, we're going to hear from Sister Teresa first, actually. She's going to respond to a bit of this. Yeah. So thanks. Go ahead, Sister.
There we go. Well, thank you, Jason. That was an amazing, engaging sense of that connection, that intersection between monasticism and place. And I think hopefully it will really resonate with a larger audience, beyond even here. So I think it's kind of maybe appropriate. I'll respond just briefly from our sense of place here in Cottonwood. And one of the things as I was listening really struck me is that I think one of the gifts of monasteries and monasticism is precisely the sense of place rooted in stability. What the phrase that popped into my head was the Celtic idea of thin places, places where, the intersection between the immanent and transcendent are closer, more present. And, I think that, that's the nature of a monastery. The other thing that I was really struck by is your use of, the idea of Lectio Terra, which I think is a wonderful way to expand on, the traditional, I'd say, reduced idea of Lectio Divina as something that's only with a written text in 4 steps and, 20 minutes a day. But the idea that we read, we enter into, we interact with, listen to the physical surroundings that we have, I think is foundational for how we understand, reverence, live with the earth. The whole book of creation is a book as well as sacred scripture and other things. So I'm hoping that, as we have more conversations, as your book gets around, that these are things that, both our monastery, other monasteries can collaborate and share with a much larger audience. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And I'm always jealous of your place. I've only visited once, but it's such a powerful place. And Wendy's here. Hi, Wendy. And you're living there now. How are you?
Yes. So, yeah, I am putting down roots. It's been wonderful to be here. I was here for a month last spring, and I've approaching 5 months here on this stay, and it's been wonderful to see the change of seasons, the returning bird life. So, my home is in the Maine woods, which is at a similar parallel of latitude to here. So I just pretty much drove across the 45th, 46th parallel of latitude to get here. And so I'm finding commonalities being at a similar latitude, birds and plants in the same families, but there are differences as well. And for some of you already know this, but I am in discernment for the co-housing program here at the monastery, a group of women who are making a commitment to live out Benedictine values and are discerning whether or not this is where we will live for the long term. Right now, I'm balancing between returning to the Maine woods where I work for seasonally for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and being here. But it's been wonderful to be balanced between the two places and reflect on the ways in which my rootedness in the Maine woods informs my learning a new place and a new landscape. This is a very special place. I mean, the building of the monastery itself was taken right out of the hillside, the blue porphyry stones that were quarried behind the monastery.
That's exactly right, yeah.
So it has a very deep sense of place. And we are on the ancestral lands of the Nimipu, as Sister Teresa mentioned. This is called the Camas Prairie, before the blue flowering camas, which was a traditional food source for the Nimipu. And there's very little of that left. It's mostly been taken over by modern day crops and ranch land for grazing cattle. So there is some of that left, but not much. So again, a long history of colonization, which I'm just starting to explore. I started going from time to time to masses on the Nimipu Reservation, and we'll be trying to learn more of their understanding of the place over time.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems like a really important piece. And it's because in Canada, we talk about settlers, right? The people are settlers. And I'm not sure how I feel about that word, other than the idea that I feel unsettled, right? Like this idea that we're not that's not our project anymore. And many of us who have multi-generational ancestry in North America, we don't have a culture or a homeland to go back to, right? Now we're talking about what does settlement look like on the other side of settler colonialism, right? So I think that's kind of an important piece of sense of place, that we're not trying to assuage our guilt or, feel like we are now indigenous to a place, but we're trying to unsettle it. And that's going to be intergenerational project, I think. And we're actually going to hear from the Land Justice Futures about some projects that are really interesting in the way that activists are trying to engage monastic landscapes in land justice, right? So there's some really cool stuff happening. And I guess that'll be 2 months from now after Samuel's talk. I'd love to hear anyone else their thoughts or questions, or if there's a slide you'd like me to go back to, happy to share the slides. Or if you'd like to share an experience from your own places. We're a small group, so don't be shy. Yeah, Dr. Sharon.
Hello, thank you so much for everything you shared. It was very powerful. I'm just going to share two things. One, I came to a silent retreat one time there at the monastery, and there was 12 of us. It was an 8-day silent retreat, and there was a woman there, and she was one of the retreatants. And her ancestors were Native American. She was Native American who lived there on that land. And when she introduced herself, she said, "I just want you to know I welcome you to our land." Even though the monastery owned the land, I thought that was a very generous and powerful thing that she did. I don't even know if everybody really understood what she was saying, but I was very grateful for that. The second thing is we live in Nashville, Tennessee, and we have for a long time. And we have bought land. We have been praying about it for 40 years, but we bought land in October, just under 9 acres in Roan Mountain, Tennessee, which is the Appalachians. And how the door opened up, how we got it is amazing. It's over 100-year-old farm. It's a little under 9 acres. And this two of the sisters that their father had owned it live on either side of us. So we want to use it to be able to do silent retreats there. But being there and meeting all the people who have lived there, and their like great-great-grandparents lived there, they were Appalachian people, has been such an amazing experience of how they identify with the land. When they came there, actually, that little section there was not Native Americans. It was on the other side of the mountain. But it's been very fascinating to see how they have really taken care of the land and how they built a community. That's the thing I have seen so much, the deep rootedness to the land and community and to one another. And they have actually welcomed us in, which they said 30 years ago that never would have happened. So we feel very honored to be able to be there. And they said, actually, the owner of that home, I mean, he was 96 when he died, but he and his wife prayed. They always wanted that to be a place to do retreats for ministers and for people in the ministry. And so we'll be doing that for people, it's not a very large place, but I thought, well, we are an answer to your prayer, because that's what we've prayed our whole life, to be able to do that. Yeah. So it's really amazing everything you're talking about, because I feel like I'm right in the middle of that learning. So thank you so very much.
Well, yeah, God bless you in that journey of learning about the place, because it's not easy, but yeah, it's an activity of listening, deep listening. And I'm not sure, for some of us, the land isn't going to speak it right away. I don't try to force any kind of sense that I hear the trees speaking to me or the land speaking in the way that many of my indigenous friends just take for granted, right? Like trees speak to them and they have, and I think that might be multi-generational too, but it's also individual, right? So I'm just trying to pay attention and not be distracted by my phone or whatever, so it's different for everybody, this deeper connection. And you'll find yourself drawn to things that maybe you didn't expect, right? Like, I'm not a geologist. I didn't study geology, but I so often find myself looking down at the ground just as much as I do looking up, because some of these islands on the coast of British Columbia are very fresh. You know, they're not a lot of soil. It's a lot of protruding rocks, and it's so swirled and like marbled, and it's just it's sacred in such a beautiful way that it makes me want to go back to school and study geology, you know, and learn that language of timefulness. Because these rocks are in motion. Right? There's a movement here that's so much deeper than our time and our understanding of motion. So that's really powerful. But that's just one entry point, right? It could be flowers, it could be grasses, it could be trees, it could be watershed hydrology, it could be birds, it could, you know, a whole range of things, at least as an entry point. And then you start to find how they're all connected. Great.
I was thinking about your concept of charged moments, and you never know how or when the earth is going to speak to you. It just occurred to me, thinking in the context of what you've been saying, how I've had charged moments in kind of a string along this roughly this parallel of latitude. In my mid-20s, I had a transcendent moment in a wilderness park in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where I wasn't looking for a spiritual experience. It claimed me, where all of a sudden it felt like everything around me. I had another with a giant Sitka spruce in the Tongass rainforest in southeastern Alaska. I was just reaching out my arms around the tree, not to be a tree hugger, but to just kind of measure what the circumference was. And all of a sudden, I felt that I could feel the consciousness of the tree and how it was experiencing the forest around it. So these were two things that, as I said, came to me and claimed me when I wasn't at all looking for a spiritual experience, which kind of makes me think more that they really were real. I wasn't trying to imagine anything. They just happened. And these were the things that propelled me into the journey that I'm in now of moving to the Maine woods, spending 20 years to get to know it deeply, and now coming to Idaho, where I see new opportunities to form connections with people who care deeply about place. But the other key point that struck me in what you said was that you don't have to be in a wilderness area. I actually recorded this. A dear friend of mine was literally on her deathbed, and she had made an allusion to me previously about an experience she had a transcendental experience in nature, and I wanted to record it before she passed. She was just about to turn 90 and had a long and full life. And so this very amazing transcendent experience that she had was in a suburban park in Waltham, just outside of Boston. She got there by public transportation. I recorded what she said, I transcribed it, and I compared it to what I had written about my initial transcendental experience in the wilderness in northern Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The language was strikingly similar. We used the same words, we had the same feelings. It was as though we had almost been experiencing the same thing together, which in a way I think we were. So I think it's very important that for people to realize you don't have to go to these sentimentalized places. You can get on a trolley in a city and go to a place where you can have just as deep an experience.
Yeah, that's important to me as a car owner in a city who likes to go to the forest across the bridge, right? It's like, I'll do that for sure, but my day-to-day sense of place is in my neighborhood. And I especially learned that during the more strict COVID-19 lockdowns where there wasn't a lot of driving to be done, but our city is blessed with a lot of beautiful street trees and diversity of trees and tons of birds. Love to hear from anyone else, but no pressure. And I just want to acknowledge one of my elders and mentors, Stephen Blackmer, who's here, who has a really powerful ministry in New Hampshire. But again, no pressure to speak, Stephen, but you're welcome to chime in.
Does that unmute me? Yeah. Well, thank you, Jason. That's such a gracious invitation. How can I say no?
I hope you wouldn't.
for those who don't know me, Wendy does, and Wendy knows this land. I'm on 100 acres of land in central New Hampshire, not too far south and a little bit west of where Wendy's place is in the Northwoods of Maine. I came here originally. I was called to this land by the land itself, and turned out to form a church. So I'm ordained in the Episcopal Church, so a wild church that's been meeting here for 10 years. 4 years ago, at the beginning of the COVID quarantines, I was called by the land to move here full time. So I've been living here as a solitary for 4 full years. And just want to kind of echo, compliment, reinforce many of the things that Jason, you've said about the resonances with the land. And one of them in particular that I've noticed there just so often is the way liturgy of the land and the liturgy of the formal prayer practice echo each other. It's just, it happens so often. It's extraordinary. Weather permitting, all our services are outside, certainly from about this time of year till beginning of November. From November to sometime in April, we have a barn that we meet in and a small chapel. But even then, in the center of the service, we take 20 minutes to go outside and engage in. I also call it Lectio Terra. Jason, I didn't know we had come up with that.
You invented that independently as well.
Yeah.
I love it.
I've also heard Lectio Mundi, but I really like Lectio Terra.
Yeah, I like Terra.
To the ground itself.
Yeah.
So the center part of our liturgical practice every Sunday includes that.
Beautiful.
When we come back from that, we share experiences of what each of us has found, encountered, thought, wondered about. The altar gets adorned with bits and pieces of the natural world that come back and that actually form the offering that we place back on the altar. So it's quite a beautiful liturgical practice.
Yeah.
And then again, in the last 4 years, I've been living here. This is a particular piece of land that when I came here a dozen years ago had recently been logged very destructively. It has since recovered remarkably well. In this landscape, no planting, in this ecosystem, no planting is necessary, that there's enough soil and enough rainfall that the land the forest regenerates very well by itself.
What's your species mix there? Sorry to interrupt. Are you mostly conifer deciduous or?
It's a combination of hardwood and softwood, red maple, sugar maple, American beech, yellow birch, white birch, black birch, red oak, eastern hemlock, white pine, red spruce. Kind of a central converting to northern hardwoods.
Yeah.
Mixed softwoods. The land is unusual in New England in that it was never cultivated. Much, not the northern parts where Wendy's from, but much of the rest of central New England was cultivated and has reverted to forest over the past 100 or 150 years. But this is not. It's been in forest all along, which is an indicator that it's actually very poor agricultural soils, which is why it was never converted to forest. But it is quite a wild and ecologically intact, even after all of the harvesting. But so I don't grow food here, but I do gather all my heat, my firewood, my water, and all my sunlight and electricity, all derived from the land. So, and it's only been 2 years since I've had Wi-Fi, so I can Zoom. So I'm glad I got that in time to join this.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm sort of doing the same kind of monastic practice. I'm wedded but not vowed to the land.
Yeah.
This particular piece of land might be a way of saying it, but doing it in a solitary form. And Sister Teresa and Wendy, I would love to come visit you. So, and I've told Jason this, I'll be making a journey west next fall. So I will do my very best to stop by.
Yeah, you gotta go.
Having this connection it seems too good not to take advantage of. So, Jason, thank you for a wonderful really wonderful presentation. I would love your slides.
Okay, yeah, I'll send them along. Thanks for chiming in, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you.
Janet.
Thank you. For the last year, I have been participating in a certification program in faith and climate justice offered by Pacific Lutheran Seminary. And it's a cohort model. Half of the 30 participants are from North America, and the other half are from Africa.
Wow.
Kind of all over, mostly the middle part of the continent. So I appreciate some of the thoughts that you alluded to about how, the things we do in this northern hemisphere so unjustly impact the people who live in the southern hemisphere. And we've over the course of the year explored a lot of theological implications and practical ideas and just a whole lot of areas about what we might do to make a difference. And I really appreciated, so I was really interested in this course because I also am a member of St. Bridget of Kildare Monastery, which is a Benedictine community.
Where?
We're a dispersed community.
Okay, great.
And so I was particularly interested in what a monastic response to, climate and creation justice, particularly looks like, or what the rule might say. I'm a little embarrassed to say I hadn't really thought about it as deeply as what you've shared, and I really, really appreciate that. And I think one of the most impactful things for me that you said was that we won't fight to save what we do not love. And I think that's like the key solution that we have to find, that we can use to ground all of the actions that we take.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. And I also, one of my favorite books of all time is Belden Lane's Solace of Fierce Landscape. So I appreciate that.
Oh, good. Yeah. Of course, I didn't coin that phrase, right? Like Aldo Leopold said it, and many other environmental nature writers have reiterated that. So just to give credit where credit's due, but I deeply believe it, for sure. Great. Well, thanks. That program sounds really cool. That you have a kind of dual continental cohort.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. Right. Anyone else? Diane, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and for sharing. I'm overwhelmed a little bit, but it was wonderful. I wanted to say that I really appreciate now that I feel like I have a vocabulary for things that I've been feeling and doing, but I really didn't have words to express that, like Lectio Terra, and like an apophatic sense of place and wanting to be in silence in creation. I went to forestry school in central New York, but I've worked out west. I was a wilderness ranger. I was a botanist and wildlife tech. So I worked in the woods a lot and have a great attachment to those landscapes. I'm a librarian now, so it's a pretty different landscape. But I'm also a master naturalist in my hometown. And that and the Center for Benedictine Life, those two spheres in my life give me the most joy. And today I feel like now I can see that they're not separate at all. And so that's really awesome. And meeting Wendy for the first time last weekend, again, just grew that feeling in me of being integrated. So I really appreciate that. So I wanted to share kind of a goofy story and then ask a question, if it's okay. So
Goofy is always okay.
okay. So unfortunately, I am fairly claustrophobic. And a number of years ago, I had to have a full body MRI, which was really a traumatic experience for me. And as I was preparing to be in this tube, totally contained and completely freaking out, I had all these ideas. I was going to say the rosary. It was like the faces of my children and everyone I love dearly, and all of this was going to bring me comfort and allow me to get through this experience. Well, it didn't work at all. And yet suddenly, out of nowhere, years ago, I helped establish a research natural area in North Idaho, a very, very special place to me called Round Top Mountain, which is now a research natural area. I spent a lot of time there in that place, becoming so attached to that place. And I haven't thought about it in quite a while. Well, laying in that tube, freaking out, and no prayers, nothing was working. That place literally came to me, and I'm convinced to this day that I body traveled to Round Top Mountain, and I was just on Round Top Mountain the whole time that this happened. And that's the only way that I got through this experience. And of course, I didn't tell my children that, yeah, you guys didn't do it for me. It was Round Top Mountain. But it was such a vivid experience of that place, almost like reaching out to me and folding me.
Mhm.
And the question I want to ask, it's just yesterday, meeting with a friend of mine. We have a little group that meets for coffee, and we were talking about the state of the world and different things. And she said to me, well, as a Christian, I feel that I'm called to not be of this world. And she was using it to explain how she has really disconnected herself from issues of climate justice and other environmental issues that she finds are too polarized or too upsetting to her. And she felt very strongly that this was that the Bible was directing her to not get engaged in that controversy. And I wanted to respect her. I didn't say anything, but it really has troubled me, because in my heart, I feel that's not what we're called to do. But I was just curious how you would verbalize maybe a different way of thinking than that.
Well, so many ideas, but I think I would start with the fact that the Bible starts in the garden and that the Bible ends with the city of God coming to earth, not the other way around. So Hebrew spirituality, if you can even call it that, is fiercely this worldly. So, I mean, if this person was going to hear it, I would maybe have a conversation about the deep commitment that the Bible has to this world, right? The age that the Messianic Jews were waiting for was a this worldly age. And there's even arguments, I think, that Yeshua, that Jesus was talking about a kind of age on this earth. But then in Paul, we start to hear some echoes of the Greeks, and the Greeks, hundreds of years before Jesus of Nazareth, were talking about the idea that what's perfect is beyond the world. And that's where we really start to get the sense that the transcendent is above and beyond, literally above and beyond this world. And so there's a real strong sense of Greek world denial that was absorbed by the later early Christians, right? Because the early Christians were Jews, and they all thought that Yeshua was going to come back from his visit to heaven and establish the kingdom. Why else would you have 12 apostles? because the earth was the primary place of the kingdom, not heaven. But then in the Gospel of John, we start to see this idea that, well, maybe the kingdom of God is not of this world, right? And so there's a deep thread even in Buddhism, even in Hinduism, and in some parts of Christianity, that the world and the transcendent are in opposition. But I think it's pretty easy to get to a view of the idea that we get to heaven through the earth, right? It's not that they're in opposition, it's that we find God in the world, right? Because, for example, the Paschal mystery is God became a child, lived a human life, was crucified before he resurrected and ascended into heaven. So you don't get to Easter unless you move through Good Friday. And so, Wendell Berry has this wonderful poem called On Hope. And he says, your hope of heaven, let it rest on the earth beneath your feet. And so I think this oppositional view is a symptom of our kind of politics of binaries and oppositional relationships, that somehow we're not supposed to be of this earth, even though we were made from clay and God became stuff to save us, right? It's a deeply incarnational religion, not a Neoplatonic one. Right? And ironically, some of the monks, some of the contemplatives absorbed that Platonism. So the cloud of unknowing, you're supposed to forget everything below in order to enter the cloud of unknowing, leave everything behind. And so I think I would speak to I would push back on a world-denying thread in Christianity and say that it's not helpful, it's not biblical, and it's not necessary to fully embrace the Paschal mystery. And if you hope for heaven, you don't do it on the other side of earth, you do it through the earth, I think is kind of where I would head with that, depending on how, familiar and receptive. Some people are not going to change their minds about the rottenness of this world, so it really depends on the level of trust and openness to that. But there's plenty of room in the Christian tradition. I mean, I think especially the Christian tradition for a world affirming rather than a world denying approach. So that's where I'd start.
Yeah, just for what it's worth, Diane, I suspect somebody who's probably not especially sophisticated in their theology, maybe one way to approach it would also be to say there's a difference between rejecting the values of this world, many of the predominant values, versus the physical world, that there's a huge difference. I mean, I think we can all kind of agree that there's a whole lot of values, that people across any spectrum would agree are not helpful, but that's different than the physical, stuff of earth. And that might be a way to begin a conversation.
Yeah, I would ask too,
Body is a
what
temple.
word? And my question is, Jason, you may know the answer to this. What word is used when we're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world? I always took that world to mean mainstream human society, as Sister Teresa was alluding to, rather than the cosmos. So that was one question that came to my mind. As Thoreau said, heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads. I firmly believe in that. And I think there's also the concept that's most helpful to me that might be helpful to your friend Diane in talking to her. I perceive God as immanent in creation, that the creation is in God, God is in the creation, God transcends creation, yes, but when we're interacting with the natural world, we are interacting in a very real sense, as I perceive it, directly with God. And so if you have that understanding, you'll care deeply about issues like climate change. Obviously, to injure the earth, to treat it with disrespect is to disrespect God. So that would be the way I would maybe go at a conversation with your friend, again, if she would be open to that. But again, Jason, I don't know if you know the answer to that question. What world are we not supposed to be of? I'm guessing it's not referring to the natural world.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think when the world is used in the Greek, they're talking about the world itself, right? But like that phrase is not biblical, in the world, not of it. It's a distinction that comes from that already established binary between heaven, our true home in heaven. And it's perfect. I think it's perfectly legitimate to talk about it as the social, political, capitalist, consumerist world. But I think Diane's friend was maybe talking more about my home is in heaven. Like I don't need to worry so much about climate change, which is where that phrase gets invoked, even if its original meaning was more the social political sense of that word. But we've lost Sister Teresa to the liturgy of place. She's gone to pray. And that might be, unless anyone else we haven't heard from would love to chime in, then I think it might be a good place to wrap things up. I've copied my email in the chat if you'd like to get in touch with me, or a copy of the slides or anything. And there's a link to the publisher in the chat as well, the book. And remember that this series is going to be for the next 5 months. So send the link around, and hopefully we'll just keep the conversation going. And honestly, our goal is to discern whether or not there might be enough interest to bring people to an in-person conference at the Center for Benedictine Living in Idaho, and that even get some of the other monastic communities to send delegates to do some like real conversation about, easement conservation, easements, ecological restoration, legacy planning, and the like. So if you know of monastic communities, you're connected to monastic communities that might be interested in that conversation about stewardship and land management, or at least the topic of Benedictine or monastic land ethics, send the series link along to them. And we'll keep the conversation going.